overview of bias and sensitivity as we dig into the California bar examination questions. They're going to be able to answer questions that we might have about the parameters and any limitations about diff analysis. And I want to remind the group, this working group is tasked with reviewing these questions. The questions have been flagged for diff in an effort to develop guidelines designed to minimize a future risk of differential item functioning. So once more, thank you all for being here and for volunteering on this important initiative. And I will now hand this over to Sarah Mastriani and to Chaitali Fadka from Scantron.
Thank you so much, Amy. Can everyone hear me? All right, great. Thank you, Bethany. Like Sal, my internet has been a little bit glitchy today. So I too, just for the duration of the presentation, I'm going to turn off my video just to open up a little bandwidth. And then as soon as that's finished, I'll come on and we can chat kind of more face-to-face if there are any questions. So forgive me for stopping to share my video, but I'm hoping that it's to everyone's benefit. And Chaitali is all queued up in case I do have too many issues, and we'll just swap who's presenting. So let's see. I'm going to share this. Share slideshow. Okay. And bear with me, Teams is my go-to. So here we go. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Amy. My name is Sarah Mastriani. I am the Director of Assessment Development at Scantron. I've been in the education and assessment space for 20 years now. I've spent about 13 of those with Scantron. And in this time, I've worked on projects for school districts, kindergarten through 12th grade. I've worked with higher education clients from colleges and universities, and I've worked with certification and licensure clients, everything from nursing to exercise specialists to orthodontia. And when I talk with any of these folks about the assessment development cycle, I always stress the need to have a bias and sensitivity review. It's really not a nice to have, it's a necessity if you're going to create fair exams. So I'm really happy to be here today to share some insights into recognizing and avoiding and reducing bias. And Chaitali, you want to say hello and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. My name is Chaitali Fatke, and I have been working with Scantron as a psychometrician for about 4 years. Prior to that, I completed my PhD from University of Minnesota Twin Cities. As a psychometrician with Scantron, I work on various projects ranging from K-12 to also on certification industry, so nursing, business communication, to clients in medical fields. And I am really excited to be working on this project and talking a bit on bias and sensitivity and diff today. Thank you.
Okay, so today Chaitali and I are going to talk about differential item functioning, known as diff, which for the non-psychometricians among us today, I would be on that list, indicates that exam questions may favor a particular population. So in other words, there may be something about a question that results in more females getting the answer correct than males, or more people over 40 getting the answer correct than people under 40. And a key word to keep in mind over the course of the next hour or so is may. Diff, as Chaitali will share, is one of many measures that organizations consider to determine how well a question is performing. It's not and should not be the only measure that's used. So Chaitali will talk about diff, and I'm going to talk about bias and sensitivity, those issues that find their way onto an exam and result in candidates doing better or worse than other candidates, even though they may be no more or less skilled than anyone else taking the exam. And to start, I just want to define a term that Chaitali and I will use frequently, and that's the word item. An item is more or less synonymous with a test question. The reason we don't call it a question is that often it's not. So if you think of an essay prompt that asks a candidate to explain something, it's just not a question. And the bar exam items are the perfect example. I've had the opportunity to read through quite a few, and they often say discuss according to California law. So they are items, not questions. We kind of use them synonymously, but I just wanted you to be aware that if we're talking about an item, we're indeed talking about an exam or a test question. So this cartoon, I'll give you just a second to digest it, is a great place for us to start today. That little fish may be the brightest of the bunch here, but there's no way it's going to pass this exam. And therein lies the goal of an assessment item. We always want to provide a fair and equitable opportunity for every candidate to display their knowledge. And with this exam, as excited as that monkey may be, it is not going to be a fair exam. So what can impact potential performance on an assessment item? First, the candidate's knowledge and skill. And this is perfectly appropriate. A candidate's knowledge and skill should impact performance. And the same holds true for someone's education and experience. These two things can and should impact performance. It's only logical, for example, that the more you study the law, the more time you spend in a courtroom, the better you'll do on an exam about the law. But how about some of the things that can impact potential performance that aren't desirable? Think about terminology or vocabulary. I was working recently with a group of nursing subject matter experts, and we were looking at an item that referenced cheeking. And these people had been nurses for years, and yet only one of them knew what cheeking meant. She explained to the rest of us that it meant that you appear to have taken medication, but you're actually concealing it between your gums and cheek. So think about that term getting onto a nursing exam. If the item asked about concealing medication, then perhaps everyone would understand and they'd do well. But if it used the term cheeking, some seasoned industry professionals could have gotten the answer wrong. So thinking about your terminology and your vocabulary is key when you're writing items. There are a couple other examples on this slide, and I will get into them a little bit later on, but the takeaway here as we get going is that an assessment item should provide a fair and equitable opportunity for every candidate to display their knowledge. Some things will rightly and appropriately impact performance, and other things will do so unfairly. So, how is an item unfair or unequitable? The answer is bias and sensitivity. Bias, of course, works in both ways. You'll have one group who unfairly performs better, and one group who unfairly performs less well or worse. Bias can be a concept or a word that's more familiar to some candidates than others. And there are all types of bias: gender, age, cultural, regional, socioeconomic, religious. The list goes on. This table gives you a visual of the many types of bias that exist. And please note that the list that I have here is not all inclusive. A good example of age bias was actually shared by some folks who were on this call recently when I learned that the word ledger is not familiar to all younger attorneys. So we need to think about all sorts of things, right? Age, gender, race, regions. The second column gives a few examples of how language can introduce bias. And I will share that I absolutely adore the range of the English language, but I always have to keep it in check when I write items, like not using the expression keep it in check. If you have candidates who are second language learners, using an idiom may put them at an unfair disadvantage. You always want to use wording that's appropriate for the exam. If a subject matter expert were to author items for a math exam, particularly for younger students, one of the things that we will always tell them is to limit the words on the page as much as possible, because it is a math test, not a reading test. The same holds true for exams for students or candidates at any age. It's often tempting to use really impressive or mature vocabulary, but I will say that unless it's industry vocabulary or terms with which test takers should know, it may give someone an unfair advantage and therefore put someone else at an unfair disadvantage. Let me touch on a few of the biases that may find their way onto a test and result in higher diff scores. Regionalisms, I always think, are a fun one, if you'll allow me that to call a bias fun. I love to use these examples when I give a bias and sensitivity training. Growing up in Rhode Island, the image on the left was known as a bubbler. And when I moved to California and suggested that someone get a drink from the bubbler, they had no idea what I was talking about, because in California, it's a drinking fountain. On the top right, these objects, which I believe are sneakers and only sneakers, can apparently be referred to as tennies, depending on where you are geographically. And I would guess that if we unmuted and folks told me what they call the things on the bottom right, we get a bunch of different answers as well: cola, Coke, pop, soda. So my point here is that using any term that's not universally understood may introduce bias onto an item. Here's an example for you of cultural bias. Never mind the many different acceptable spellings of these foods. People of Middle Eastern descent are at a significant advantage with this question. A candidate may know everything there is to know about a ketogenic diet, but if the foods are unfamiliar, there's no way for them to demonstrate their knowledge. In this item, though perhaps subtle, there is some stereotyping. The doctor's male, the nurse is female, and if you get to the bottom of the slide, you'll see that the female is portrayed as making a mistake based on the phrasing of the question. Something else worth pointing out on this slide is the font, something that maybe we don't often think about, but fonts can be a bias as well. They should always be clear, always be legible. And with the exception of my 1 year as a third grade teacher, I can't in 20 years remember an exam that required the test taker to read cursive, but this item would. Writers and reviewers need to always ask themselves, what knowledge are we asking people to demonstrate? What skills are we writing to? And if anything within those questions, if anything within the item falls outside those parameters, we really need to make some revisions. This, I always find the contrast between this slide and the next slide really interesting. Graphics can also introduce bias. So if you try to understand who's who in this graph, it depends entirely on color. And the next slide that I'm going to share shows you how someone who is colorblind sees this graph. So if you ask someone with colorblindness to answer a question that requires the interpretation of this graph, it's as fair as asking that fish to climb the tree. So I've shared what bias is. I've given you some examples of items that contain bias. And now Chaitali is going to talk for a bit about differential item functioning. And I promise that I won't just leave you as bias as a problem to be solved. I will come back when Chaitali's finished, and I'll talk about some possible solutions. So Chaitali, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. So I'm going to take the discussion on what impacts the potential performance forward by talking a bit on what constitutes the performance or exam scores. We often equate candidate performance to candidate ability. Now, in psychometric sense, candidate performance is reflected in the observed score on the test. This observed score is a composite of a true score and some error. So this idea that the observed score is a composite of multiple factors gives us that equation that is observed score is equal to true score plus error. Now, what is a true score? Well, true score reflects candidates' true ability at the task. Now, this true ability is devoid of any extraneous variables or factors or any noise. So if we were to measure performance in ideal circumstances, if we had perfect scale or test form, and if candidates were at their optimum level of mental and physical abilities, and if the testing conditions led to complete error-free environment, then we would be able to see their true score on the exam. Of course, real-life situations are different from that. And even if we would like to create a perfect error-free environment, that may not be the reality. And so unfortunately, we have no way of knowing the exact true score. And so psychometrically, true score and error constitute observed score. And so what is error and where does it come from? Well, error can be systematic or random, and it resides in a lot of factors. Random error typically occurs during one administration. So some examples of random error may be guessing or misreading a question. Other examples of random error are mental or physical state of the candidate, or factors like candidates' motivation on the day, how tired they are, or whether they are ill. These factors also affect test scores. This random error uh, may affect how candidates score differently on the exam. Um, and so magnitude of this error may vary across different candidates. However, statistically, this type of error is assumed to average out over a large sample of examinees. The nature of the test form also as such has no control over this random error. Systematic error, on the other hand, is caused by many factors that systematically affect measurement of the variable across the sample. Systematic errors are typical attributes of the person or exam that would occur across administrations. These errors typically do not have much to do with what is being measured. For instance, if there is a loud traffic going by just outside a room where the candidates are taking a test, then this noise is liable to affect all candidate scores, in this case, systematically lowering them. Another example could be an exhaustive item that with excess verbiage that asks a simple math problem, and that simple math problem is what is intended to measure, what it is intended for to be measured, however, not the candidate's ability to sort through that verbiage. Measurement errors can be systematic or random, and today we have been discussing a type of measurement error known as bias, as it relates to candidates from certain population sections performing differently from some other section of the population. So in psychometrics, this phenomena of different performances across subgroups for the same level of ability is reflected in what is called differential item functioning. As the name suggests, it is a characteristic of an item that results in differential or varied performances across subgroups in the population on that particular item. There are various statistical indices which help us understand the extent to which diff may be present in an item. So here is an example of diff. What you see on the screen is item characteristic curve, and this is an item curve for what we call uniform diff. Now you see two curves, one red for reference group and the blue curve is for control group. On the horizontal axis, we have ability plotted, so candidate ability, and on the vertical axis, we have probability of correct response to that particular item. So just for a sake of simplicity understanding, reference group is that group which is assumed to be at a higher advantage in answering that particular item, and focal group is usually a group who is at a disadvantage of answering that item. Now, how do we tell that this particular item has diff? Now, if we look at, say, ability 0 on that x-axis and just see where those curves are at ability 0, the red curve is at a higher, a red curve gives you higher probability than that point on the blue curve, right? So what it means is that candidates from the reference group have higher ability or higher probability of answering that item than candidates from the focal group when they have the same ability. So we are still looking at ability 0, for example, and in that case, the red curve performs better than the blue curve. So that is an indication that different subgroups are responding differently to an item even when they have the same ability. On the next slide is an example of a non-uniform diff. Now, what we need to see here is this is an example where from ability of -4 to about 0-ish, the blue group has a higher probability of answering that item correctly. Whereas as we go higher than 0, now the red group has higher probability of answering that item correctly. So it's not that red group is consistently performing better across that ability axis. Up to ability of 0, focal group performs better, but above 0, the reference group performs better. Now, how do we detect diff? We sort of now know what diff is. There are various ways of detecting diff. One is there are visual methods like the previous slides showed. So in similar way, we can plot item characteristic curves for all our test items and compare different group performances on items. The curve like shown, however, can be plotted only when certain measurement models are used and not all. And even if you use visual inspection methods, it's always a good idea to follow that with computing your stats. So another way of detecting diff is using statistical methods that help you understand whether the items have diff, to what extent, etc. So I have listed two most commonly used stats. One is Mantel-Haenszel method, and other is Liu-Agresti estimator log odds ratio. These stats can be computed as diff index for each item on the exam form. And those items with moderate or large significant diff stats indicate difference in group performances. Here I have presented critical value of diff. So when we talk about Mantel-Haenszel, if the critical value is greater than 3.84, then that indicates that that item has diff. In case of the other stat, if the value is between 0.43 to 64, that tells you that there is a moderate diff. And if the value is greater than 0.64, that tells you that there's a large diff. Once we have computed the stats for all items, we then also need to look at effect sizes, which basically tell us how big the differences are. Because although the statistical significance is helpful, the effect size actually tell us to what extent the differences are present. And diff flags can vary in significance. They can be low or medium or high, and therefore it's important to look at the magnitude of the differences. Of course, the values that are displayed on screen are based on diffs produced for sample taking the State Bar of California exam. So for the given sample size and given types and groups analyzed, we found that those were the critical values to be looking at. And also, it is always a good idea to look at multiple methods when trying to figure out whether certain items contain bias or not, if you're using diff as one of the indicators, just because statistics are influenced by many factors. Okay, so like all stats, interpreting the numbers associated with diff also involve digging deeper in understanding what the numbers are telling us. So when we note diff flags for a particular item, it tells us, yes, there are differences in different subgroups, but we also need to look at what is the pattern of the diff, what are the differences telling us. A set of critical parameters to look at is also sample sizes. What are the characteristics of taking the sample? Because if your subgroups are too small, or if your samples are skewed in one way or the other, then that can result in your statistical estimates, which are less efficient. And as a result, those diff estimates may be misleading and may not be telling the real picture. We also need to think about, can it be that the differences are natural phenomena and they are not necessarily coming from bias in those items? Can those be controlled if we had better items? Is there any part of the item that is causing those differences? Or are there factors like group membership and group membership only that are causing the differences? And so taking the same thoughts forward, we need to remember that diff is a statistical tool that helps us understand how item performs across subgroups. Interpreting stats cannot be a siloed approach, and therefore the stats also need to be interpreted in the context of parameters, including sample characteristics, practices, and processes followed around development of the exam form. What is the role of confounding variables? Were factors like socioeconomic characteristics of the group um, uh, considered? What are the sample sizes? The content experts also need to be a part of the process from the beginning of the exam development cycle. So strong diff values can indicate bias, but they don't get.
I lost Chaitali. Did anybody else?
Yes.
I can't hear it either.
Yeah.
Shaitali,
Chaitali, can you hear us? Let's see. Can we ping her? Let's see.
Use the chat function.
This is James Bolton. I'm keep getting cut out.
Oh, I'm getting cut out on you too?
I'm cut out every 2 minutes. I have to call back in.
Oh, that's frustrating.
yeah, I think a few of us have experienced that.
I had that problem. I solved it by downloading the actual Zoom installer online. I think it's an update that's bugged. So you have to reinstall it.
Oh, that's frustrating. I'm sorry. I'm able to see. Oh, is Chaitali still chatting with us? I'm going to move on since this was her last slide. So maybe we can have her, if she can get her audio to work again, we can have her come back to this slide at the end if need be. And I'm able to see a couple of faces in the corner of my screen. So if I should cut out or anything, please, just give me a wave and I'm sure that you'll catch my eye. So Amy, I can see you. You just give me a thumbs up that we're good for now.
Yes,
Okay,
I just
great.
noticed that Chaitali though is she can't hear us, so I'll let her know that you're going to move forward.
Perfect. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks. All right, well, as promised, I won't leave you with just what is bias and examples of bias, and I'll take the next few minutes to share how we can reduce bias. And the phrasing of that statement is really key. It is important to note that bias, it just cannot be eliminated. Our goal is always to reduce it. Even our best efforts won't eliminate it. So if you think about an item that references a VCR, it would be outdated today. We would need to update it. We might update it to a DVD player, yet the DVD player is close to being outdated as well. So with the passage of time comes new biases that you just cannot always predict. Here's a look at a solution to the graphic that I introduced a little bit earlier that had a color bias. Everything's now black and white. There's no reliance on color to interpret the information. There are relatively easy ways to avoid gender bias or stereotyping. If you think about the example where the doctor was male and the nurse was female, we could reverse that. We could make the doctor female and the nurse male. We could avoid any reference to gender entirely and just have a doctor and a nurse. In fact, the bar does that extremely well with some of the items that I've looked at. It's just a chef, or I'm trying to a dog walker or a dog sitter. So that's something that I commend that writing group on. And we can always use gender neutral terms. So instead of a policeman or a fireman, you can say a police officer, a firefighter, use waiter or instead of waiter or waitress, use server, and so on. Here are some additional ways to reduce bias. Conscious language. Conscious language is, it demonstrates an awareness of the audience. It's reasonably familiar to all groups. It's not wordy. It doesn't contain extraneous information. We avoid bias by excluding information that cannot be reasonably known through experience. So consider a math problem in which a football team scores 2 touchdowns, and the item asks what was the total points scored by the team. If you're not familiar with football, you cannot answer this question, and it has nothing to do with your ability to add. When it comes to diversity, balance is key. I have a very good friend from Lebanon who owns a restaurant serving Middle Eastern food. And it makes perfect sense that a person of a particular ethnicity is running a restaurant with that ethnicity's food, but that same ethnic group should also be represented in other roles on the exam. Avoid perpetuating any stereotype. Have females working on a construction site. Have male house cleaners. Ensure that no person, no group, belief, or practice is portrayed as either a universal norm or as superior or inferior to any other. The People First Respectful Language Modernization Act was enacted in 2006, and it requires the use of respectful language when referring to people with disabilities, and it puts the person before the disability so that it's describing what a person has, not who a person is. One example is instead of saying the autistic person, People First language would say a person who has autism. A diabetic patient is a patient with diabetes. We also need to avoid sensitive topics, or at a minimum, treat them carefully. Not all cultures celebrate birthdays. Not all test takers will be familiar with all holidays. Items about living people may need to be modified if that person dies. Someone well respected can become a controversial figure overnight. Companies may dissolve or become embroiled in controversy. My daughter, a little anecdote, my daughter's reading teacher recently gave the class a book list, and students had to choose a book to read from the list. I happened to pick up her book and start reading it myself, just curious of its contents. I was so taken aback by the profanity and the adult concepts introduced literally on the first few pages that I completely lost focus. When I picked the book up, it was out of curiosity. What was my daughter learning? How could I help her when it came to writing a report? And instead I was thinking, how could the teacher place this on the list of acceptable titles? And were other parents as incensed as I was? And that's what happens when a candidate sits down to an exam and the content for them is upsetting in some way. So we lose focus, we lose time, and to perform your best on an exam, you really can't afford to lose either. The bar is going to have to make frequent exceptions to any list of sensitive topics. I imagine there are items about wrongful death lawsuits, an insurance company not paying for property damage that occurred during a natural disaster. And that's exactly why we call these lists topics to avoid, topics to treat carefully. There are times, the bar exam being the perfect example, when such topics just can't be excluded. Unfortunately, there's no computer program that's going to put a red squiggly line under the bias on an exam. It's introduced by humans, and humans are the only way to identify and reduce it. And for that reason, programs need a robust and rigorous writing and review process. Item writers and reviewers should be well versed in how to spot and avoid bias and sensitivity issues. There should always be multiple reviewers who represent a diverse group of people. That's the single best way to ensure items are as close to bias-free as possible. If every reviewer is from Rhode Island, Bubbler is going to find its way onto an exam. Subject matter expert reviewers should be male and female. They should come from varied backgrounds, different parts of the country or the world, and have had diverse life experiences. A skilled copy editor, highly recommend as well. They can be familiar with a particular program style, and it's just another great safety measure because he or she can ensure that everything is looking and reading uniformly within and among exams. So Chaitali has kind of shared up until her last slide about diff. I've shared some insights into various types of bias, how we can reduce bias in items. So in the remaining time today, we're just going to look at a couple of actual California bar items. Because Chaitali and I do not have subject matter expertise in the law, we asked Lisa if she'd be kind enough to share some insights on what she thought when she was reviewing these items. So Chaitali, if we have her back, will explain the diff analysis results for each item. And then I'll give everyone a minute to skim or read the item. And then I'll share some possible insights as to why the analysis returned as it did. So Chaitali, do we have you back?
Yes, I'm back.
Fantastic. We lost you on your last slide. We caught most of it.
Okay.
Was there anything you wanted me to go back to?
No, I think I'm okay. if there are any questions, we can always go back and go over those slides.
Perfect. Let's do that then. Okay. So Chaitali, if you would just give us a high level, what does this blue box information mean? And then we'll let folks read through the question.
Sure. So in that blue box, you see diff analysis results for this particular item. That item was about community property, and it appeared on the exam of July 2015. Then the bunch of numbers that you see are basically your different diff statistics. So there are three groups of statistics within that each group. The first stat is Bantel-Hensel. And the other stat is the LOR ratio, because we looked at both of those statistics. And we looked at gender variable, we looked at ethnicity, and we also looked at school type. So this particular item seemed to favor females over males, and Caucasian community over all the other ethnicities that we looked at, and also CA-ABA under the school type category. Particularly the African-American community or pool of candidates taking this exam were found to be at a disadvantage. And also in the school type variable, out-of-state ABA attorneys and CA registered were found to be at a disadvantage.
Okay, so why don't I just give everybody 30 seconds to kind of familiarize yourself with the item itself. So first, a couple of kudos. We, in this item, used company. Company's not going to dissolve, it's not going to be found in any kind of controversy, so great to not use any real names there. The necklace to Wendy was a holiday present, which is great. We avoided saying birthday present or anything more specific, which was super. So with this item, Lisa had a thought, and I'm paraphrasing here, so please don't hold her responsible for anything that I misshare. She felt that perhaps females performed better on community property questions. Maybe it was correlated to the fact that more women, that more women attorneys gravitate toward family law practice. It's important to recognize that if Lisa's correct here, it's not a bias within the item. It might be a reason for the results, but it's not anything that you'd want to change about the item. I have two friends, both police officers in California. They recently took the detective exam. Amanda's now a detective with the gangs unit, and Julie's a detective in homicide. And it wouldn't surprise me a bit if Amanda performed better on any exam related to gangs and Julie performed better on items related to homicide. They had equal access to all of the information leading up to the exam. They just had different interests. So it's possible that Lisa is onto something here with females gravitating toward family law, but it's truly not an issue with the item. Lisa also shared that perhaps this question requires knowledge of California law and that out-of-state ABA applicants may not have been taught California-specific law in law school. Another interesting point that she came up with was that foreign JD applicants may not have been familiar with condo as being short for condominium. All right, take you to a next item. So Chaitali, you're up with our diff analysis results.
Sure. So again, a community property item appearing on the exam of July 2017. In terms of the groups that it favored, females and CA-ABA for school type, particularly out-of-state ABA displayed highest diff for this particular item. And attorneys, foreign JD, and CA registered were all found to be at a disadvantage. So all of those subgroups also had moderate to large diff for this item.
Thanks. And again, go ahead and take a moment to familiarize yourself with the item. Oh, and I'm sorry, condo is in this item, not the previous. So the thought here was very similar. Females tend to perform better on community property questions, perhaps because they gravitate toward family law practice. The question requires knowledge of California law. And attorney applicants taking the AX, I'm not sure if you actually, if that's how you say that, will have been in practice for at least 4 years in a state outside of California, and maybe by that time have specialized their practice away from family law and are practiced in non-community property states.
Sarah, if I could just clarify, AX refers to the attorney exam, meaning that somebody who's registered for the exam has been an attorney and is eligible to take the one-day exam versus the two-day exam, which would include the MBE portion on day 2. So just to clarify for the group.
Perfect. Thank you, Amy. Okay, Chaitali, tell us about Deb's diff analysis results.
So this item was from evidence category appearing in July 2018 exam form. This for the gender category, it favored females strongly, also Caucasian group under the ethnic groups that we looked at, and also CA-ABA for the school type. Particularly in the ethnicity category, Asian group showed highest diff for this item, and foreign JD also had large diff, and other focal groups were also found to be at a disadvantage. And I mean, under the school type category.
Okay, and another minute for everyone to read about Deb. So here's a really great example of how writers of bar exam items are just not going to be able to avoid all sensitive topics. I would never encourage a middle school teacher to give this as an example for something on an exam, but for the bar, it's needed. Again, what did I notice in here that was really well done? We didn't specifically you did a really great job not specifically calling a particular person by name or making him or her male or female.
Yeah, well, and plus, I just want to observe that
Yeah.
we did try to switch roles here. The female is the one who's the batterer, and the male is the victim.
Yep. And the thought here was that perhaps foreign JD applicants are being disadvantaged because it requires knowledge of California law, and they may not have been taught California specific law in school. Again, doesn't make it biased, just kind of tells you what folks need to, what you may need to focus on before you take this specific exam. So we'll look at just a couple more. This one is about Betty and Sheila Chaitali.
Yeah, so this one is on professional responsibility, appearing on July 2018, favoring females, Caucasians, and CAABA again. Groups that were found to be at a disadvantage were Asians, non-Caucasians, and Black/African American community. Foreign JD also showed highest diff for this item, and other focal groups from school type were also found to be at a disadvantage.
Great, thanks. And now everyone can familiarize themselves with the item. So again, a nice job. One might expect it to be more stereotypical to men charged with armed robbery. So that's a nice, not perpetuating any stereotype in this item. Some more insight, again, may require knowledge of both California and national rules. So non-California school participants may not have been taught California specific law in school. Other than that, nothing really else to explain why we're seeing some of the other results that are in that box on this slide. So we'll take a look at two more. This one is about attorney Ann Chaitali.
Again, on professional responsibility, this appeared more recently. That was on February 2019 exam. This particular item was not found to be affecting gender group or class school types, but in the ethnicity category, it favored Caucasian group, and Asian group was found to be showing highest diff, and non-Caucasian group was also at a disadvantage.
Okay, and go ahead and read the item. And the only insight that was offered here was that perhaps again requires knowledge of both California and national rules. And all of this is great. So while the diff analysis results may indicate that one group may perform better, it really seems very akin to the example that I gave about the two friends who are now detectives. Really more about interest than an actual bias in the item. So let's take a look at one last one. Chaitali?
Yes. So this item was about torts. It appeared on, again, February 2019 exam. And it wasn't found to be performing differently in various ethnic groups or school types, but sorry, I meant in gender category and school types, but in the ethnic groups category, it did favor Caucasian group, and Asian group showed highest diff. Non-Caucasian group was also found to be at a disadvantage.
Okay, go ahead and read the item. So oftentimes when we bring new writers on board, my particularly for kind of K-12, if you're writing a reading passage or something for school age children, I often say to write what you know. So I read this item thinking, did the author have some kind of experience with this? And I thought, oh, the folks on this phone must have seen and heard quite a bit during your careers. So Lisa didn't offer any, obvious bias that she could find, but something that Lisa, if you would like to speak to it, feel free. But I thought what you uncovered was fascinating. Does it mean that the item needs to be changed? Absolutely not. But what Lisa did was she actually uncovered an article or two that showed Hispanic and Caucasian community members are more likely than the average to have pets in their household. 70% of the article said 70% of Caucasian community members own at least one pet. 69% of Hispanic community members are pet owners. Conversely, only 43% of Asian community members own at least one pet, and 44% of Black community members are pet owners. So is that a bias within the item? No, but a very interesting theory behind perhaps why we're seeing that the Caucasian group is favored and that the Asian group shows the highest diff. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, Chaitali and I thank you very much for having us today. We hope that you found the information helpful, that you're able to take maybe some of this back to your writers and your reviewers to help them with bias and sensitivity reviews. Are there any questions that we can answer?
Hi, it's Heather. I'm just curious if in the situations where you found that there was a diff for certain ethnic groups, Asians or Blacks, were there any post interviews with the test takers to get their opinions on whether they felt there was bias in the questions themselves? I know you all did your own analysis of what you think, for instance, the pet research, but has anyone actually interviewed the test takers to get their thoughts on any particular bias?
On the Scantron side, no. I'm not sure if the bar folks have taken any action based on the analysis results, though I can't speak to that.
No, there have not been. There haven't been any follow-ups with any of the test takers. But it has been suggested, though, to potentially do some outreach to exam takers, some kind of focus group as a way of gathering more information too. But it has not been done.
I appreciate that. Something in our previous conversations that I hadn't thought about that your research actually highlighted for me is, especially in the places where you noted that maybe it was California law specific and that might create some of the diff. those of us who took a prep course before the bar know that they intentionally point out, like, if you didn't go to school in California or you didn't choose to take these classes like community property while you were in school, they emphasize that you must study that in the prep course. But I wonder how many people from diverse groups who are also out of state and then are not taking prep courses don't get that heads up, and therefore it creates this domino impact. So that was something interesting. Also, the particular topics, when we started with the first two examples of community property, and you were saying, you know, the diff might be created by people being out of state. I was like, well, yeah, that's logical, and not necessarily around diversity, but really about diversity of geographical diversity, right? But it made me think about really studying, are there certain topics, certain subjects that we are running into bias and diff with community property, but also the evidence one was interesting and made me start thinking about criminal law and criminal procedure, where there may be some sensitivities just because the topic lends itself to it. On the first community property example, for instance, the husband was paying the child support, and no one noted that in your presentation, but I think there's some bias inherently in that, right? That it's always the man that has to pay it, and there must be some wrongdoing going on there. So I just think those were some highlights that I hadn't thought about before that will be interesting in our analysis.
If I can, something that also came to mind, which wasn't pointed out as much, is, and I'm not as familiar because the law school I'm with is ABA accredited, but for our non-ABA schools, the extent to which the emphasis is being put on certain things like the professional ethics questions, where you highlighted that California ABA schools may have had an advantage or been in an advantageous place. So I'm wondering for future analysis whether or not there's some look at, as non-ABA accredited schools provide any type of bar prep support, if they're providing that emphasis on the California distinctions.
Any other thoughts or questions specifically that Chaitali or I can address for you? Well, then I thank you once again for having us today. Really appreciate it. Lisa, a special thank you to you for your help with some insight into these items, and to Heidi as well for sharing all of the back and forth information over the last few weeks. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for your great presentation, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, I believe that Sal and Bethany, our co-chairs, may be experiencing technical problems. So we could move on to our next item. I will guide us through this in their absence. So, you know, Sarah and Shantali, thank you so much. If you guys want to go, then we can move on to our next agenda item. But that was a great presentation, so thank you so much.
Well,
Thank you. I'm going to answer an item in the chat, and then we'll hop off.
Okay, great. All right, so
Sorry, Amy,
yes.
if you're going to answer any questions in the chat from panelists, it would be better to just go ahead and read the question out loud and answer the question so that our attendees have the benefit of hearing the answer.
Of course, it was my question. I apologize for the interruption. I was struck by how great this presentation was and thought my law school faculty could really benefit from hearing about how to construct exams that are perhaps not as influenced by bias. So I asked Sarah for her contact information, just like email or something.
Done. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
And also, this session is being recorded and it's public. So, Shalak, if you are interested in accessing this, it will be on our website after this meeting and accessible to others. Mhm. Okay. So with this background, I think we wanted to talk about our strategy for proceeding with this dive into the questions. And some of the ideas on the table have been to look at those items that had a high rate of differential item functioning, the same way we did now. In these instances, I know we went quickly, but perhaps looking and targeting some of these items that had a higher rate of differential item functioning, a differential, so that we can look and find any potentially try to discover any patterns that might lead to a list of recommendations for exam development. That was one of the items that has been suggested. Another has been to look at the process itself, perhaps at a future meeting, discuss the exam development process and just to have an understanding at what point recommendations would be used. There are various aspects to this. There's the development process. So we have people who write the exam questions. We have pre-testers. So we have drafters, pre-testers, and then the EDGE team who work on the finalizing these questions and preparing them for a question selection process. And that's when this committee of bar examiners, the attorney members get involved in the question selection process and finalization before it gets on a bar exam. So perhaps, one of the suggestions is a discussion around that process itself. So put that out there as ideas for our next steps for this working group. Because again, I know I keep hammering this, but ultimately what we're seeking from this group is a list of recommendations or suggestions that we can use for implementation in an effort to try to reduce and minimize differential item functioning. So any thoughts around that?
I think it would be interesting or recommended to have a bias analysis done kind of at each of those steps, right? So when the questions are first drafted, but before they go to pre-testers, maybe having a consultant or someone take a look at those questions so that they are situated in the best possible light from the very first draft, right? Or the draft that's going to pre-testers. I think it would be interesting to have diverse pre-testers now that we know there's differential or there's diff for, Black or Asian, test takers. I don't know if they are in the cohort of pre-testers, so that, to your point, Amy, earlier about like focus groups and stuff, that's almost a mini focus group in flight, right? We can see if in the pre-testers we're seeing that same diff and try to address it before it hits the general public of test takers. But I don't know if the composition of the pre-test takers is, reflective of the population, the general population that takes the test. But I think there's an opportunity there to get some learnings, not only about like how hard the question is or whatever the standard things we're looking for, but really about this diff at that point. And then based on those learnings, taking another look at it again with the EDGE team prior to finalization and distribution in the actual exam. So those are my top of mind thoughts just based on this.
And just to follow up on that, because Amy and Lisa, I know that last year, the COAF working group, Heather was part of it, looked into kind of the diversity of the pre-testers. And those are kind of from the pool of like graders in general. And I think we did have some suggestions. So it's kind of like the chicken and an egg. We have to try to really diversify like the applicant pool in order to have a more diverse pre-testers and so forth. So, but yeah, to Heather's point, obviously, if there are more diverse pre-testers, it would help to identify some of this, because you couldn't go beyond the pre-testers, is my understanding, right? Because of confidential sensitivities to you don't want to compromise the test.
Yeah.
So it would have to be either staff and your pool of testers. Is that correct, Amy, Lisa?
Yeah, it'd have to be the pool of graders that we normally
Graders, yeah.
Yeah, we can't just, we
Yeah.
can't pretest to the actual applicant pool.
Yeah.
We're going to be taking
Of
the
course.
exam. Yeah, and we
Of
have
course.
started to implement in the greater pool, because the pretesters do come out of the greater pool, the greater pool. And so we have implemented some or all of the suggestions that co-op had last year.
And Dawn, thank you. I thought we had made some suggestions around it, but it's been a while, so I couldn't remember. But thank you for reminding me of that.
We did make some suggestions, and admissions has been working with our office to kind of implement them. They've done a great job, but it's going to take, my understanding, and Lisa can clarify, some cycles because of how the application is released, the recruitment process, and so forth. And the admissions is tracking more demographics, so we'll have more of that because there are a lot of people, right, Lisa, that were unreported, I guess, in terms of like you weren't sure, so we didn't have quite, yeah.
Right. We're asking more specific questions in the greater applications at this point.
But I do think if, again, and forgive me if we've already received this information a lot in my head, but I think it would be great if we could get, if it's possible, to get the information about the diff and how much the groups that were impacted, parsing down what percentage of those came from out of state and we're taking the California bar, what percentage came from non-ABA schools. Now, again, that we have that kind of additional layer of complexity that goes into the diff, I'd be interested in knowing, because that's then we can interject in the process before they even get to the exam to give some, study tips and things that might help to resolve some of those issues.
The challenge that we have is that we have a pool of questions, over a 10-year span. So, right now they're categorized by the level of diff that each have under the 3 different categories, in terms of, I'm gonna forget the technical terms, but there are 3 different categories about the level of differential item functioning that it demonstrated. And again, it's on those also 3 areas. So it's between gender, race, ethnicity, and school type, were the variables that were the focal areas. And so to find out like what the composite of that exam taking cohort is will be challenging because the questions come from a 10-year span. So, how the questions were categorized today in terms of the question itself, and then the impacted group, who it favored, and then who was at a disadvantage, is probably the best way that we could present this information, because each of these questions come from a different examination cohort.
So while we may not be able to further parse the information from this study, maybe forward thinking, now that we have some concepts about how those issues could impact the test takers, maybe we can start to integrate some practices and then study if we see a difference going forward. So for instance, if we're identifying out of state diverse candidates who are planning to take the test, we can interject earlier in their study process to say, make sure you study. We think there's an issue around people, particularly diverse candidates not being familiar with subjects that are specific to the California bar. So please make sure you study those, and then see if in the next 2-3 years we see a difference based on that proactive information, and conduct a study again in a few years to see if it had any impact at all.
And it seems like, Lisa, you and Scantron have done a really great job with the few questions that we saw highlighted. So I don't know if it's like in terms of our next steps, because if we can get kind of a running list and then kind of develop kind of a guide for when you go to develop questions, I think that's helpful, because even the few that you highlighted today was really enlightening. So I think it does take a little bit of a closer analysis for us to start seeing patterns and putting together a list. But yeah, and Amy, I don't know at what point we talk about kind of next steps as well, but that would be my suggestion, is if we can kind of develop how we tackle it, because it was very helpful, Lisa, that you worked with Scantron at that level.
Yeah, so Scantron were they were the ones that picked out those questions. They just gave them to me and said, "Do you see anything in these, and what kind of observations?" So I don't exactly know how they chose those. I mean, obviously, the numbers, based some of those on the numbers of the different kinds of diff that it was flagging. So I don't know if we want to, there are. I mean, I think pretty much every question of those 152 did result in some kind of diff. So I don't think that, I'm assuming that the group doesn't want to look at all 152, but rather focus on, I know Ron had a suggestion about maybe, picking a certain number of high diff and a certain number of low diff to maybe make some kind of comparison.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think maybe picking that subset. I remember Ron saying that, because if we can look closely at whether it's a dozen or 2 dozen and start maybe creating a matrix so we can get some type of pattern, like the community property issue today. Heather was, and I think we would all agree, kind of criminal related issues might be ripe for some, we could take a closer look. Then we can start to put together some type of, I don't know, guide for development.
I also thought it was funny, the bias within the people studying the bias, in that, the bar exam is a written exam. It doesn't have, except for the multi-state part, it's not multiple choice. And Scantron is all about multiple choice as a company, and even the presenters, their frame of reference around K through 12 and, college and stuff is just, I just noted that in and of itself, that they are familiar with a certain audience and a certain test taking process that is slightly different for the bar exam. So, I thought they did a great job, but I wonder if you had deeper familiarity with our process and our exam itself, if that would change their thought, their analysis in some way. So. Okay. And that goes to the point of, we can't eliminate bias. We can only try to, lessen it a little bit. Everyone's bringing something, some view.
Exactly. I know I want to be conscientious of our time. We have about 7 minutes left. And so I'm wondering, should we proceed as Dwan has suggested and perhaps identify I don't know, like at least 10 more questions in each of the 2 categories that Ron had recommended, that is in the high, I'm simplifying it, in the higher and medium categories of statistical rating in terms of differential item functioning. And maybe what we could do is share that with the group and then come and have a discussion about those at our next meeting.
Amy, if I can make a suggestion, because I know when we worked on our COAF kind of smaller working groups, that perhaps we can break into like smaller working groups so that we can review them and maybe convene for a call or 2 before we come back with a larger group, because I find it helpful to kind of brainstorm with a couple other folks.
Okay.
But only if other folks are open to that. It would just require us kind of convening for another hour call separately from the larger group. So.
That all sounds great to me.
Okay, so why don't we proceed with that plan for our next meeting? And what we could do is have Heidi poll the group to see what would work like in the next month or so. And in the meanwhile, in the interim, what we'll do is share those questions with the group. And then Dwan and Lisa and Elizabeth and I can work on how these subgroups will work out, like the interim calls we have before we all get back together. Does that sound like a plan? Okay, great. And I'm so sorry about the audio. I do believe it's related to a Zoom update that perhaps is impacting everyone, because it looks like when people have updated their Zoom system or the Zoom app itself, that they've been successful at staying on and not having these audio problems. So I apologize for that. I hope our next meeting, it gets solved before our next meeting. So my apologies.
Plus, I think with the update, you get this cool blur that me and Shalak are using right now that I don't think I had before I did the update. So there may be other perks that you get from just running the update.
I was wondering how that was happening.
It was,
Yeah,
it's a
got
new
an email.
background once I did the update. So I started seeing people on meetings have it and I was like, how'd you get the blur? And then they said, you have to do the update.
Our information services sent an email saying, do the update and you get the blur. And we're all like, yes, update now. So,
But we missed out on your art, Shalak.
oh, well, I can.
All right, so then I think we have our next steps. And if, are there any other questions or thoughts or concerns, ideas?
This was great. This was so helpful. I felt like before I was still missing a piece in some way, and this really helped pull it together and create some clarity. So thank you so much.
Great. All right. All right, well, thanks everybody. We will be in touch then.
So it looks like both Sal and Bethany may have had dropped off due to technical issues or something, but you know, normally one of the co-chairs would just announce that we're adjourned. So is there somebody else on the diff working group who can take that honor for them?
Heather, would you like to do that?
Sure. I announced that we are adjourned. Is that sufficient, Caroline?
Yeah, as long as there's no further business on the agenda, that will do it. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Dr.